Lily, thank you so much for being on my podcast. As I reiterated prior to hopping on, I cannot tell you how much of a fan I am, and how your book, Real Food for Pregnancy, was in the past, before Real Food for Fertility, the gold standard. The only thing I told patients when they came in with their positive pregnancy test, I said, well, yes, take your prenatals. And also this book, so much so that it was the only book I ever had at the clinic and the only one that's on my Amazon storefront. So thank you so much for writing it, because I know I did nutrition in school as well, my undergrad, but your information is so out of the box that I know it would have taken a lot of courage and a lot of effort to have dug up all of the studies that you did. And I just want to really thank you for that, because it's so much easier to give people information and then to give them a full book full of research, as opposed to just, I've done this research and it's kind of over here, and I've done this research and you can read the study there. It just makes it all very digestible. And so thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
When I posted on my Instagram the questions that people had for you, first of all, there was a flurry of excitement. And second of all, they were a lot of questions from patients that I have been seeing who are currently already pregnant. So I have my own questions for the fertility side of things. And then I have questions from your fans. So obviously, we're going to start with my questions first, because I'm the one who got to see you and lead the interview. Haha, Instagram. And so I really wanted to start with, in your first book, you talk a lot about the importance of setting the stage, similar to that of a garden. So making sure that before you plant, I think you used like a tomato plant as the original analogy. You know, a seed is a seed. You plant a tomato seed, you're going to end up with a tomato plant. But the garden is, or the success of that plant and the health of that plant is very much dependent on the health of the garden and the health of the soil before you plant that seed. So I was wondering if you would be able to give your top advice, maybe top 3 things that people should really be aware of just before they even start thinking about trying to conceive.
Sure. Yeah. How to kind of nourish the garden, so to speak. Well, first of all, I think a lot of the conversations around fertility kind of center on egg quality, which isn't necessarily a bad place to focus, because there's a lot of overlap with the things that support egg quality, that support all of the other things. But and we have a whole chapter devoted to egg quality and Real Food for Fertility, right? The information's there. We will appease you with that knowledge. But we have to think beyond just the egg. We want to make sure that, the vessel, your body, your uterus, that this egg is going to implant into is healthy. So I think first and foremost, I would say, and actually I had a post on this that was kind of the inspiration for this whole book, which is that healthy menstrual cycle sets the stage for a healthy pregnancy. We don't want to solely just focus on the egg quality itself. We want to make sure that each month your body has the raw materials and the hormones to build a lush, robust, healthy endometrium, which is the first home that egg implants in. And there are actually like glands within the endometrium that is what supplies nourishment to that new teeny little embryo. And that endometrium is also where your placenta is going to form from embryonic tissue to create that like maternal fetal interface for the blood exchange through the umbilical cord to the baby, and also the the removal of toxins and other metabolic waste that are coming out of circulation. We need that to be in a really good place. So I think of the healthy endometrium almost like the soil of a garden, so to speak. And, our fertility is very, very sensitive to nutritional and lifestyle inputs. In fact, if you think about like all of the functions of our body, things that are just required for a single person to survive, fertility is kind of optional, right? You can survive for years and years and years without having a menstrual cycle or having a completely screwed up menstrual cycle. You can also survive without ever bearing children, right? It is an optional function. And although I think it's optimal that we do have a ovulatory healthy cycle for as long as we can, it's not a like default function of your body where if that stops, you're done for. So it's very sensitive to our environment and our nutrition. Even under eating like 25% calories less than our body requires can cause our hormones and our menstrual cycle to become disrupted to the point where you stop ovulating and eventually stop having your menstrual cycle altogether. And so the first place that I focus is on like making sure that your home, so to speak, for that new egg is nourished. If you want to take it from the egg quality angle, though, we can look at how long it takes for an egg to develop. We have tons of undeveloped eggs in our ovaries, and those are recruited and then go through this long, long process of being prepared to the point that they are ready, fully mature and ready to be ovulated and can potentially be fertilized. And, potentially you can become pregnant, right? If you go back to that recruitment as an underdeveloped ovarian follicle, that's 220 days in counting backwards from ovulation, 7 to 8 months. So I think as a culture, we have this sort of concept that, you don't need to really do anything in advance of conception. And maybe at one point that was more realistic before our diets got all screwed up and the food industry ruined everything, and all the toxins and environmental exposures that we have now that maybe we didn't have in centuries past. But if you're thinking about optimizing the chances that you will have a healthy enough egg and a healthy enough endometrium to receive that egg, you do want to be kind of rewinding the clock to look back at how can we optimize this. So that's precisely the type of information we try to provide you with, because that is not necessarily the conventional approach to fertility and to conception.
No, most definitely not. What I've noticed too, anecdotally in clinic, is that patients will come see me typically as like an 11th hour scenario in a lot of cases, where they have tried everything else and now they've come to see the fertility witch because, conventional medicine hasn't worked. And it's very interesting because a lot of the time, these are patients who have tried IVF who have never had a period. So we're getting patients who have either had PCOS that is not well controlled or that is very stubborn, or hypothalamic amenorrhea. And they've been sent to the clinic and told, you don't need a period. Like, don't worry about it. You can just conceive. We'll do a retrieval. We'll put you on hormones. We'll put you on, stims. We will do a retrieval. We will then, fertilize the egg. But then they neglect to think about how if you haven't had a period, your uterus and the uterine tissue is not going to be overly receptive to hormones, even if they are pumped up to the highest that you can possibly, do safely without risk of obviously
Right.
like blood clots. And it's just really interesting because my approach is very annoying to people, in that I insist that we work on getting a period
Yeah.
before we do anything else, because we need to make sure that the uterus is ready. And what I
Yeah.
found very helpful is actually bumping up protein stores. So, not just focusing on the hormones involved, but specifically focusing on fats and proteins, which then obviously helps those hormones involved, but makes it more tangible. Like I'm able to give them things that they can do on a daily basis. So, as opposed to just like a slew of supplements, rather telling them, okay, I need you to eat. And they'll actually look at me like I'm mental, 4 eggs a day. And they're like, I will die of heart disease. Like, you will not. It's so funny because it's such easy advice, but it's so poorly received um,
Yeah.
from so many people who have otherwise terrible eating habits. Like, I had
Yeah.
one patient who I had her do a food journal for me. She's so funny. I love her. She'll appreciate this. I'm sure she'll listen. Um, and she would have sheet cake, like Loblaws sheet cake, at least once, twice a week as a minimum. But she was worried about the eggs.
Right.
I was like, the eggs in the sheet cake are not sufficient. But
Right.
funnily enough, when she was able to thicken her lining and become
Yeah.
pregnant, she got me a cake that said better than eggs. But she's since kept up the egg habit because it's helped her feel so much better just in her
Yeah.
daily life now as a mom.
Yeah.
So, would you be able to give your favorite foods for helping patients thicken their lining? Not necessarily patients who have pre-existing like hypothalamic amenorrhea or PCOS, but rather just someone who's coming to like a clinic, for instance, who has a thinner lining
Yeah.
and a
Well,
lackluster
even
period.
if even if you have those other conditionings going on and also have a thin lining, the same advice applies.
Perfect.
So, first and foremost, you have to eat enough food. Um, with HA and PCOS, there's sometimes like somewhat opposing things going on nutritionally, even if technically part of the intervention is somewhat similar, but the same sorts of things help with supporting the lining. Enough calories, but making sure that the majority, it doesn't have to be all, we don't have to be crazy, but the majority of your calories are coming from nutrient-rich foods. We have to understand that in order to thicken the lining, you have to bring your hormone levels up. So enough calories, first of all. B, you have to provide the raw materials that your body uses to build reproductive hormones. And those hormones are built on a backbone of cholesterol, which you get from animal foods. And those animal foods tend to also have saturated fat along with them. So your advice to eat eggs with the yolks, for example, is good advice because they're intaking then a good amount of cholesterol to provide that backbone for the hormone production. You're providing protein. You need protein to support your metabolic health and hormone production as well. And I go into quite a bit of detail in chapter 2 of Real Food for Fertility and all the roles that protein plays really for optimal hormonal balance and optimal menstrual cycle health and fertility. And that is, by the way, the number one thing that I tend to focus on in practice. And almost every fertility specialist who's actually like in the know and focusing on nutrition, that's one of the number one places that I find that they focus as well, is bringing the protein intake up. Not only are you getting the protein and for the animal proteins, the cholesterol that comes with it, but our protein-rich foods are our most micronutrient dense. And we need those micronutrients for a number of processes in the body, methylation being one of them, which is absolutely vital for like egg quality, sperm quality as well, and for all the processes of early conception, early embryonic development to actually like work properly. You absolutely need that running very smoothly. You find a lot of those nutrients in your protein-rich foods. So I would focus there definitely. In fact, when they have done intervention trials where they put women on a low-fat diet, you see substantial drops in their estrogen and progesterone levels. So it's key. Since protein in nature naturally comes packaged with fat, you're hitting two birds with one stone as long as you're not obsessively taking the fat out of everything. So leave the yolks in your eggs. Most of the micronutrients are in the yolks. Leave the fat on your steak. Leave the skin on your chicken and turkey. Leave the fat in your dairy products. Full fat dairy products are associated with better fertility, better ovulatory function, and better outcomes with IVF than low fat dairy. So it's not just, the calcium or the other micronutrients that might be in the non-fatty components. You actually need that fat and cholesterol and the other like fat soluble vitamins and whatnot that are in the fatty component. The cream, the yummy things to include for reasons beyond their protein intake. So we covered eggs with the yolks, full fat dairy products, essentially all of your animal proteins, your seafood, your fish, including some that are like cold water fatty fish for those omega-3 fats, and maybe optionally, but especially beneficial, some shellfish like oysters, clams, mussels, super nutrient dense. When it comes to your animal foods, all the parts of the animal. So not just the muscle meats and not just the lean part of the muscle, but the fatty component, the organ meats, the saving the bones and using those to make bone broth. Those all have their individual micronutrient makeup and amino acid makeup that is beneficial for fertility. And then I also like people to include some, good quality produce, some fresh fruits and vegetables. I'm not against really any of the foods that I haven't mentioned that are whole foods. I'm not necessarily against, but I just like to highlight some of the ones that are the most nutrient dense in particular. But with the fresh produce, as much variety as you can, because the greater the variety of micronutrients you're also getting. Fibers that are coming from those vegetables and fruits are really helpful for binding to and helping carry toxins out of your GI tract, for helping your body excrete the hormones that have kind of like done their job and been metabolized and need to leave your system. Like we do need some fiber in there as well. So making sure you're getting some of that along with all your protein-rich foods, I'm in a happy place.
That's amazing. Yeah. What would you say though, and I'm sure you get asked this constantly. Preface, I at one point was a vegan, and then when I went to get my doctorate in Chinese medicine, where every single professor that I had told me that I should promptly start eating animals if I wanted to live a long life, and which was not what I was expecting them to say. Like, I lived in Victoria, BC. It was a very vegan happy place. I had no idea this is what I was walking into, but they were right. I had horrible health conditions that I just thought were normal. And switching to like a more paleo diet actually not only healed my skin, improved my cycle health, just helped me just generally overall. But but I was an easy sell because I was very much a hypochondriac, and so the idea of me caring for my well-being was before I even wanted kids was like a no-brainer. That being said, I'm sure you run into a lot of time people who are vegans, vegetarians, who are wanting to promote their own wellness. And I'm just wondering what you say in that instance.
Well, the first thing I like to ask is tell me about your dietary practices and what has you eating this way.
Right.
So I can understand what's the rationale. There's all sorts of different reasons people choose to eat that way or not. If the reason that they're choosing to eat that way is for health reasons alone, then that's easy. If their reason for eating that way is for environmental, ethical, animal rights reasons or religious reasons, that's a lot trickier. There are ways in which you can optimize a more plant-heavy diet, but my experience and the research that I, outline in the vegetarian chapter of Real Food for Fertility kind of goes through some of the common areas that it can be a mismatch for fertility. And I say this as a former vegetarian myself, and I still have loved ones who are vegetarian and some that are vegan as well. So I'm not a person who's going to like try to convince anybody to do anything, because if I can't convince my own loved ones, then, you know, um, but if the reasons are for health promotion alone, that's the easiest angle in to have the conversation. So a number of things can become a concern. You can take it from the micronutrient angle. There's a lot of nutrients that may not be found in plant foods, may not be found in a form that is bioavailable or usable by the body, or your body cannot convert in high enough amounts to a usable form. They just may not be concentrated enough in plant foods. So you will, even though it's there, you will likely be deficient. And so making sure that any nutritional gaps, micronutrient wise, are met through supplementation is one angle for sure. It still leaves the other components, which are oftentimes vegetarian and especially vegan diets are low in calories. And sometimes this dietary pattern is chosen on purpose because it's low calorie, or gives them an excuse to not eat foods, because we do see higher rates of disordered eating and overt eating disorders among vegetarians and vegans. I've actually talked to a number of them who are like, yeah, I really just had an eating disorder, and this was a really easy way for me to be like, yeah, I can't eat that. No, I'm not going to have that. You can use this excuse of higher than thou ethics or animal rights or whatever. But really the underlying thing was a rationale to have a socially acceptable way to undereat. So we often see caloric intake at 1,500, 1,600 calories a day in vegetarians and vegans, and this is not enough to support hormone production. So certainly that can be made up for by eating more food, and certainly vegetarians need to be really diligent about eating enough food. There's still an issue with macronutrient balance, with protein and plant foods being in such lower concentrations than animal foods. It takes actually quite a bit more calories in order to meet your protein needs. So that's a consideration. Carbohydrate intake is often very high, and the kinds of fats that are consumed often favor a really high omega-6 intake, which can be detrimental for ovarian health, egg quality. This only touches on a handful of things, but as a whole, like the literature to date has shown a higher prevalence of menstrual cycle issues and ovulatory issues among women who are vegetarian and vegan. So part of what we do in that chapter of Real Food for Fertility is kind of outline all of those factors I discussed and more, some options for optimizing. For those who still include eggs and dairy products, for example, there's a lot you can do in your diet to optimize intake of things, even though still some supplements are needed. And then we also go through, for those who have decided to no longer eat this way, what are your options for reintroducing foods? Because that's the next most common thing I'm asked is, how the heck do I transition off of this diet? Well, I mean, many times you've been eating that way for years, sometimes decades, and it is scary. Certain foods might be disgusting. You don't know like where to focus. So we kind of go through, handhold it a little bit with you to go through some of your options for reintroducing, and which items you might prioritize and for different reasons. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And again, when I talk to fertility professionals like yourself, the ones who are more in the integrative space, in addition to the protein concern, like the secondary component of that is like there's an underconsumption of animal protein in specifically, and these are the ones that we're seeing with the greatest challenges in conceiving. If they do conceive, the greatest challenges with pregnancy complications as well. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it is really hard. Like, I think physiologically, it's a big challenge for women to get adequate nourishment and maintain optimal hormone balance without having animal foods a part of their diet.
Yeah, no, I controversially said on another podcast that the only patients I really struggled to help conceive were vegetarians and vegans. And then I was able to achieve, you know, optimal fertility, and help them conceive once they reintroduced, more palatable food for them that was animal based. So
Yeah.
I had one patient, for example, who was, an omnivore for her first and conceived without issue, and then subsequently suffered 4 miscarriages back to back.
Yeah.
And I was racking my brain because she had gone and done all of the recurrent loss panels, various biopsies. Everything was coming back completely normal. And I didn't know because she didn't actually tell me that she had switched to becoming, vegan. Um, and so when I sat down, had like a debrief with her, going through everything that could have possibly have changed between her son and now this, second baby, what we found out was that she had stopped eating all animal products. And it was for
Yeah.
me like, okay, obviously, like, no wonder your period is, non existent and with irregular cycles. And, according to fertility clinics, that can still be normal. But in my practice, having a period, every 23 days and then every 42 days, and having that period be, a day long is a huge issue. But
Yeah.
for them, it's, well, that's fine. If we can make you ovulate, I'm sure you can become pregnant,
Right.
which is like such a qualm. But we were able to integrate, eggs and actually fish collagen into her
Yeah.
coffee and smoothies. So that was actually all it took. It didn't take her,
Yeah.
diving off the deep end and having steak tartare for breakfast.
Exactly.
And I feel like sometimes when you do suggest that, people are like, they're so thrown. So I'm so glad that you recommended that, like dipping the
Yeah.
toe
We go
approach.
through all the gentle ways to reintroduce, and I've heard exactly what you're describing. I know one woman who they had been monitoring her endometrial thickness, and it was all good. And then 1 month she did like a vegan challenge or something, and they like measured her lining. And they're like, "What did you do? Like you have no lining." They're just like
Yeah,
it's almost undetectable. It's so thin, and that's the only thing she changed
this is
and
the
before
thing.
it was totally normal. So yeah, they see it. I don't know why it's not something that is asked more often because it can be like very immediate response.
Well, this is
Yeah.
the thing. I really struggle with food recommendations for patients because it's so much harder than supplement recommendations, which people are willing to do so much faster than they are change their diets. But even the supplement recommendations are typically like a B complex, um, iron, uh, collagen, protein powder, like things that you can get a lot easier in an egg than you can, you know what I mean, in all of
Yeah.
those recommended concoctions. Um, but I do find like that you're almost really like you're thinking so out of the box when you recommend to these patients that they just increase their protein and that their iron matters. I had this one patient, she's a hematologist, and her doctor is one of my favorite fertility doctors in the city. And they couldn't figure out like her lining. It was so thin and they were working so hard to like thicken it. So much estrogen. Like it was insane. And I was like, your ferritin is 8. Like
Oh,
this,
wow.
this seems to me to be
Yeah.
like a very obvious outlier. And they were like, no,
Yeah.
no, I'm sure it's not gonna make a big difference. I was like, you're also doing daily blood draws. Like you're losing
Right.
blood on the
Yeah.
daily.
Yeah.
How could that
Yeah.
not
You need the raw
matter?
materials to build more red blood cells, my friends. Yeah.
And it was so wild. They were like, we should do a study because I had her increase her iron and then increase her protein and her lining thickened. And it was like this.
Ooh, it's
Yeah,
magic.
that's right. It was this, oh my God, we should do a study. And I'm like, no, this is basic common sense. But so much of common sense, I feel like, infertility.
But they
It's just
should
thrown
do
out
a
the
study so
window.
that it's published in the literature because people don't believe these things when there's not published
Right.
papers on them, right? So
That's
yeah, they should do a study. It's obvious to us, but
but not so much. It's so funny, yeah.
yeah,
I mean, even things like fish oil, for example, and like the capacity of it to thin your blood and improve circulation. It's like
yeah,
that's like so far out there to recommend to people as opposed to like taking a daily aspirin. Like you
right,
could get so much more by taking fish oil. And it's just so like, whoa, what a thought. Meanwhile, what do they tell you to stop taking before surgery? Fish oil. I don't understand how there's no
right,
like, correlation
right.
between like anticoagulation when it comes to surgery and then anticoagulation when it comes to fertility and how they are in the same camp. Um, in terms of egg quality, I have a lot of patients who are doing IVF. Do you have top foods, like as individual foods that you would really recommend that people focus on for, I mean, 8 to 3 months prior to doing an egg retrieval?
I mean, definitely a lot of the same foods that I talked about earlier. I could give you specific reasons why I'd recommend those foods, but those would be the areas that I would focus on. So, um, certainly organ meats would be a good idea. Liver, especially, would be on my list, but also heart, if people have ever had heart, chicken heart or beef heart.
Right.
Um, in the full Chinese medicine side of things, I'm sure there's all sorts of supplements and things that people could take for those as well. But if you look at like antioxidants that support egg quality, like CoQ10, animal heart is the richest source, dietary source of CoQ10. Certainly, it could be supplemented as well. With liver, there's, I mean, a slew of micronutrients in liver that are highly beneficial for supporting egg quality. But one in particular is vitamin A. Liver is our richest source of vitamin A in the usable retinol form. This plays a really important role in follicular development, egg quality, ovarian hormone production, and also early embryonic and placental development. So, if you happen to have a client who has signs of low vitamin A intake or low vitamin A in their serum, then that would be a time where I'd be even more proactive about recommending having some liver. We talked about eggs and cholesterol, but liver is also very rich in cholesterol. It's giving you kind of that like structural backbone for hormone production. Um, I would also recommend, in addition to food, spending some time outside without sunscreen to boost their vitamin D production, or you can be supplementing with vitamin D. That also plays a huge role in ovarian function and egg quality. Food wise, it's funny, like a fairly small proportion of our vitamin D intake is actually from food, about 10%. 90% of it is sun exposure, or if there's not sun exposure, supplementation. But still, food provides some, and it's mainly in fatty animal foods. So full fat dairy products, all of the marine seafood, especially the fatty ones. We think of like, cod liver oil, for example, being really rich in vitamin D. It's in seafood and fish. You get teeny tiny amounts in mushrooms, certain mushrooms that have been exposed to UV light, but it's a different form your body doesn't utilize quite as well. But no qualms against mushrooms, they're good too. Um, I would also be focusing on your antioxidant intake. So things like selenium, vitamin C, vitamin E. These are things that really help to combat potential inflammation and oxidative stress. The egg is just very sensitive, as our sperm, to oxidative damage. And so having those antioxidant stores, I guess, or antioxidant intake in a good place can help to offset that. There's also the amino acids that help support our ability to combat oxidative stress as well. So the amino acid cysteine, which is commonly supplemented as N-acetylcysteine, but is also found in our protein-rich foods, supports the production of our own endogenous, our body's own master antioxidant, glutathione. So we need to be getting enough of our protein-rich foods so that we can maintain healthy liver function, healthy detoxification, and our ability to combat oxidative stress. Carnitine is another one. When we think about the egg, the human egg has more mitochondria in it than any other cell in the human body. It is just like an energy power plant. And the mitochondria are very, very sensitive to oxidative stress and also deprivation in any nutrients. So the nutrients that help support mitochondrial function, therefore, also tend to benefit egg quality as well. And one amino acid in particular, L-carnitine, is really vital for mitochondrial function. There's been a ton of studies that have looked at the effects of L-carnitine. Usually they're doing supplementation on fertility outcomes, on ovarian function in women with PCOS, on egg quality in women undergoing IVF and whatnot, showing really beneficial effects. And we find the highest amounts of carnitine in red meat. So red meat would be kind of hit many of these nutrients, but also be the ones that are providing us with a really good amount of cysteine and a really good amount of carnitine for those who don't want to supplement. There are others if you want me to keep going, but essentially, like, I'm just providing you little individual micronutrients that are in all the foods that we've already outlined. So you let me know if you want me to keep going.
No, I love that. And I like that you've brought in all of the important mitochondrial powerhouses as well for sperm production, because I actually have a lot of patients who similarly, they have partners who are vegans and vegetarians, and they've been told, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. Um, eat whatever you want. And they're not even necessarily given supplementation, even though there's been so much research on the importance of antioxidant supplementation for improved sperm capacity.
Yeah.
So I think that really is an excellent highlight for why potentially both sides of the coin need to be dealt with when dealing with like sperm egg health to create like a healthy embryo. Um, in your first book, The Real Food for Pregnancy, you also highlighted two really important factors that stuck in my brain when I was pregnant. So I've had 6 babies. You helped me with 4 of them. The first 2 I didn't know about you and your wonder. But for the last 4, I was pretty diligent about maintaining like a paleo diet. And I not only had better pregnancies, but I also had very easy labor and deliveries and then postpartums. Interestingly, with the first 2 where I didn't have as much animal product, and I definitely didn't get as much vitamin D because I was living out west, in sort of Vancouver area where there isn't very much sun. Um,
Yeah.
those 2 kids, my first 2, not that they're little experiments by any means, but they have terrible teeth, like just absolutely the worst. And for what I potentially saved on protein, I have doubled, tripled, quadrupled my dental bills for them. Um, trying to fix
Yeah.
their very wretched mouths. And it doesn't matter like how much vitamin D I give them now. So it's
Right.
interesting to me. The stat that stuck with me is that in prenatal nutrition, women who had an increase of blood sugar, their babies had a higher risk of congenital heart defects later in life. And then women with higher insulin levels, their babies had a higher incidence of neural tube defects, which you never ever hear about. There's very little focus on that. There's now some focus on the importance of choline and how it prevents neural tube defects, thankfully. But all we ever hear about is folic acid, and the importance of taking folic acid, and then you're good to go. So much so that I've had OBs here in Canada tell patients, "Oh well, you've been taking, folate. Oh God, well, like let's hope that come, your 20-week ultrasound, everything's okay." What are you talking about? Drives me crazy. There's this OB in the States. She's such a bully. And she's like, it's the hill that she's going to die on, this folic acid hill. And I was wondering
Yes,
if,
I know her well
oh,
because her and
God.
her army have come after me with some like death threats. Yeah. So
Like, what is the point of
yeah,
that? And I
it's all
think
insanity.
it's such insanity. Even if you publish nutritional articles, it's completely ignored. And then when you've talked about, okay, well, like, what's your basis? If these articles don't matter, what's your basis? And the basis is clinical experience, I think, is the importance. I'm like, what does that even mean? You can't argue with clinical experience. Anyway, we'll leave that there. We're definitely on the hit list now. But I'm just wondering, what is your thoughts on folate and the importance of it in fertility and how people can focus on it prior to conception from a nutritional standpoint outside of supplementation?
Yeah, so the folate conversation, I mean, I've devoted a lot of time and resources to try to clarify this and provide women and practitioners with like accurate information on it because you're just bombarded with very mixed opinions. Um, so I do have a very detailed article on my website on folate versus folic acid. There's no paywall, heavily referenced. I recommend people give that a read. Um, we have to understand, just to give you kind of a high level summary of that information, though, we have to understand that the term folate is like an umbrella term. Okay. It refers to any type of folate. There are 150 different types of folate, probably more, naturally occurring in whole foods, although the vast majority of what's in our whole foods is methylfolate. And then the term folate also encompasses the supplemental forms, some of which are made to be identical to the forms we find in food, and some of which are synthetic man-made compounds that are not found anywhere in the food supply or in nature. That would be folic acid. Um, if we think through folate from like a logical perspective, like yes, we do need folate for our health, and it is one of many nutrients actually that's been identified as contributing to a higher risk for neural tube defects. Even certain toxin exposure, by the way, or elevated maternal blood sugar has also been implicated in higher risk for neural tube defects. Okay, it's more than just folate. We actually don't even know the mechanism by which folate or the purported miracle folic acid prevents neural tube defects. And actually, folic acid doesn't prevent all neural tube defects because there's something called folic acid resistant neural tube defects, which explains about 30% of neural tube defect cases that we see, where despite the mother supplementing with sufficient amounts of folic acid, she still experiences a pregnancy complicated by a neural tube defect. So what's going on there? There's something other than folic acid or something other than folate that's playing a role in these, right? But to me, I think the missing piece for some of these practitioners is that they're not looking at the biochemistry. The biochemistry of it is that 95 to 98% of folate in our body, in our red blood cells, and in baby's circulation is methylfolate. That is the form that our body has the sort of metabolic machinery to process. Some of us have a greater challenge at being able to process other types of folate, especially folic acid, because folic acid requires several steps of converting it into methylfolate before your body can use it, okay? So folic acid is useless to your system until your body converts it to methylfolate. The challenge here is that about half of the population has a defect in a gene called MTHFR where they cannot convert folic acid into methylfolate at the same rate as somebody without that defect. And depending on which type you have, it may not affect you all that much. It may only be like 30% compromised, but some of these defects are more severe, and that's like a 70% reduction in your ability to process synthetic folic acid. Those are the individuals where we see some of the greatest fertility challenges, and supplementing them with ever increasing doses of folic acid not only doesn't fix the problem, but it makes it worse. And until you switch them to methylfolate, because that's really what their body is trying to get in the first place, you don't see conception rates improve. So I think the hill to die on for some of those folks who are really pro folic acid, they won't listen to me in the biochemistry. I mean, I responded to this sort of outrage over my article with literally a 2-hour professional level webinar via the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, going through folate and methylation as it relates to fertility and pregnancy, laying out all the research, laying out why there is this resistance to using other types of folate, why the research is limited sometimes on other types of folate, why our food supply is fortified with like the wrong form, and why we see these guidelines like not shifting. But some of these people just don't want to hear it. They refuse to hear it. And I think the issue is that they are not acknowledging basic biochemistry. It is basic biochemistry that our body has a preferred form of methylfolate. That's the preferred form. And if it is unable to convert it into methylfolate, this is where we see a functional deficiency in folate and a deficiency then in methylation, no matter how much folic acid you throw at it. So we're really doing a disservice as a whole for not acknowledging the reality of how these different forms of nutrients are processed by our bodies. And I have lots of resources on it. I also have a section in Real Food for Fertility going through MTHFR variations and how some of them are associated with fertility concerns, but some of them aren't, because a lot of people in this camp are also like, MTHFR is meaningless for fertility. And it's like, that is not true. There are certain types of MTHFR variations that are more severe than others that require more attention. And some of them you may be fine. I mean, I myself have one of the mild MTHFR variations. And so I try to make a greater emphasis on getting enough food folate, for example. When I supplement, I'm making sure to get methylfolate or some of the other forms of folate that are more metabolically useful. And I myself had no fertility challenges, have 2 healthy children with no neural tube defects, and I'm not, suffering the consequences of this, genetic variation. But I also have a mild form of it. If I had a more severe MTHFR mutation, I may have to be substantially more diligent about all of those things I just mentioned to avoid a potential issue.
Thank you so much. That was everything I could have dreamed of and more, by way of not only that answer, but also this interview. I just want to thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your effort, not only for this interview, but also for those 3 books. I'm so excited to see what you come up with in the future. And I feel like women's health is benefiting so much. And I can only imagine how many babies you've made a huge difference to. I know for sure 4 of mine, who the last 4, again, they're not experiments, but they have no teeth issues and they're left home with their father for a significant amount of time, which would render them, honestly, shockingly, that they're alive when I return home. So
yeah, we didn't get into the vitamin D part, but there is data on the vitamin D deficiency, and they call it dental enamel hypoplasia. So weaker, less optimally formed enamel on these babies, because those teeth buds are formed in utero.
It's
and
wild.
I similarly had both my babies while living at high latitudes. I mean, I had my first when I was living in Alaska, and it was actually quite shocking. I had moved from a southern climate, and down there I would just go out. I mean, you could see I'm pretty fair skinned, but I would make it a point to lay out in the sun for about 45 minutes at a time once a week, weather permitting. And I was able to maintain vitamin D levels of 45, 49.
Right.
I was in a good place with my vitamin D levels, no supplementation. In Alaska, even if the weather is permitting, which it rarely is, I tested my vitamin D levels each trimester. I was that really annoying patient where they're like, you're going to have to pay out of pocket for this. And I was like, well, I just want to see. Um, and my levels had dropped down to like 30. And I actually needed fairly high dose supplementation, more than what's used in the studies to keep my levels up.
Right.
Thankfully, my children have not suffered from teeth issues, but I have to wonder if I hadn't done that,
Yeah.
would they have issues? Because another friend of mine who was up there with me and had her first up there, massive dental issues, had to have multiple teeth pulled. They're just like rotting out of her head.
Yeah.
And there was no vitamin D supplementation there. So yeah, we need to, and it's not just vitamin D, there's other things too. I think protein intake and vitamin K2 and calcium and magnesium and all the things also play a role. But at least for what we have documented data on, this whole like catastrophe, I mean, it's something like a third of children now have dental enamel hypoplasia. It's really quite high, and we do have evidence from reputable journals showing an association there, and that supplementing mothers can potentially reduce that risk. So yeah, we need lots more like research, but even acknowledgement of the research we currently have showing how some of these simple, very low cost interventions can play a lifelong role in your child's future health and need for all these interventions and things that cost a lot of money. I mean,
Yeah.
they do. Back when I worked, not to go on a tangent, but I'll finish it up here. Back when I worked at the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program, which sadly over time became significantly defunded, every dollar that the state spent on our program saved the state $5 in later healthcare costs, because the children born to the mothers who had better blood sugar control as a result of being identified and like properly managed, they were healthier, like they had less need for all these medical interventions. Having a child diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, that's going to cost the state a lot of money if they're on state funded healthcare, right? We
Yeah.
could potentially prevent that, or maybe delay that diabetes diagnosis until much later in their life, which you can imagine that the carryover effect on cost is substantial.
Yeah. No, I think about that often, along with, the statistics that you've provided in your book as well, about how your nutrition when it comes to your pregnancy not only impacts your children but also your children's children. And I think that's going to become more and more apparent as time goes by, but unfortunately for so many people it'll be too late at that point. So, I think
Yeah.
the fact that you are providing us with these resources and just being so approachable and flexible in the way that you're presenting them is just so appreciated. And I just appreciate you so much. Thank,
Oh, thank you.
thank you
Well,
so much.
yeah, I think each person has to kind of decide, like none of us are coming into this world with optimal everything, right? I mean, our parents, our grandparents have often had imperfect exposures in their life, and
Yeah.
especially the generation currently being born now, just with the prevalence rates of like prediabetes and diabetes, like there's a lot of suboptimal metabolic health that we're getting from our parents and whatnot. But at some point, we have to be the ones to be the sort of the cycle breakers, to sort of borrow an adage from the trauma community. You can also break the cycle of inadequate nutrition. And as you've shown just with your own babies, how it wasn't necessarily genetics that caused, you know, all of your kids will have this dental issue. It's like, no, you kind of proved the stats wrong right there
Yeah.
with having a dietary change and then seeing the result firsthand. At the end of the day, all of our kids are kind of experiments, right? We'll see like what plays out. I think we have to give ourselves grace in just the fact that not all things are within our control, but also we can at least celebrate the positive aspects. Like, hey, I come from a family with a heck of a lot of diabetes, and I've got these,
Healthy
really
kids.
metabolically healthy kids. Like,
Yeah.
we have to celebrate the little victories here too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think the more information's available, the more that will be possible. So
Yeah. And like you said, sometimes the change is as simple as just adding some eggs to your diet.
that's
It's
right.
like,
Yeah. Some eggs
yeah,
and then now
yeah,
listening to this podcast for further
yeah,
information on how to do that.
yes.